Thank you for listening to Offline and Unfiltered. We are your hosts, Lakeisha and Megan.
On this podcast, we bring you unfiltered conversations on business and culture through listener stories, expert interviews, and a little bit of shit talking. Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to today's episode of Offline and Unfiltered. Very excited to have our guest, Heeral, with us today. Heeral, do you want to introduce yourself to our guests?
Sure. Hi, everyone at Offline and Unfiltered. It's really great to be here. My name's Heeral. I am an EDI consultant working in the UK. I've been doing this work for about 10 years. It'll be 10 years in October, so that's kind of exciting. And I help organizations really try and understand some of the trickier elements of EDI, how to have conversations about EDI in a way that makes them productive rather than switching people off. So that's kind of my MO.
And Heeral, for our American listeners, can you define what EDI means?
Yes. I know in America you call it DEI, and I reverted back to form. I totally forgot. So it's equality, diversity, and inclusion. Some people, when they say EDI, they mean the E to equal equity. People use the E's are often interchangeable when people are just using the acronym.
Yeah, super interesting. And so for our listeners today, we may go back and forth. We may say DEI, EDI. We're going to try our best to try to keep it consistent, but I don't think we will. But yeah, Heeral, thank you so much for that definition.
Heeral, so thank you for joining us today. I'm just curious if you can share a little bit about your journey into the field of DE&I and what inspired you to specialize in this area.
So I actually started off doing something completely different. Before going into this line of work, I spent about 15 years in insurance financial services in central London. My job was to be a risk professional. I was an actuary. So I had a very statistical background, the echoes of which still reverberate to this day. I love a good spreadsheet, and that's never going to go away. But what happened was it was around about 2011, 2012. I was looking around thinking, I really do not think I can do this work until I retire. And I was having it was a bit of a career-wise, it was a bit of an existential crisis because I didn't know what else I wanted to do instead. And for those of you who don't know what an actuary is, if you don't know anything else, let me tell you this, that they get paid very, very well. And so I wasn't about to jack in that career without having at least some sort of drive to do something else. Rather than running away from it, I wanted to go towards something. I had no idea what that was, which was a little bit depressing at the time. But what I noticed at the same time was that the insurance sector in London was starting to have conversations around gender diversity at leadership level. And there was a lot of head scratching going on with people asking themselves, leaders asking themselves, oh, why don't all the women we have at our organizations filter on through to the senior most levels? Because at graduate level, it's 50-50, and up to a certain point, it remains that way. And then all of a sudden, we start to see a drop off. And it was kind of astounding to me that level of head scratching was going on, because it was quite clear to me why that was happening. That wasn't the problem. That wasn't what drove me to come into EDI, though. What really did it was when they started having meetings with groups of managers. I worked at a very big organization. Just the London office, I think, had about 2,000 people back then. And I was a manager. They were having little town hall meetings with all the managers saying, this is what we are going to do to ensure we have more women at senior levels into the future. But the thing is, the way in which they delivered that message, their heart was in the right place. fine. But the way in which they delivered that message was so clumsy that I actually said to the guy who was running that meeting, I said to him afterwards that, look, I know what you're trying to do and I totally get it, but the way in which you have imparted that message, you have ensured any senior woman you hire now is going to be seen as a token hire. And I don't mean the men are going to see her that way. Everyone's going to see her that way, because even I'm going to see her that way. And it was just astounding to me that people who are very intelligent at the top of companies had no idea how to get the message across. And I wasn't coming at it from any place of expertise, but I just knew that I could get that message across better than them, if nothing else. And that kind of lit a fire that I hadn't realized. At the same time, I was training to be a coach, going to courses at weekends and stuff in my own time. And I just decided it was a very, very naive decision in a way, but if I'd thought about it too much, I never would have done it. I basically decided in 2013 that this is what I'm going to do. My notice period was 6 months. I know that doesn't happen very often in the States. In fact, I understand your notice periods are usually really short. But my notice period was 6 months. So I decided in October of 2013 that in 1 year's time, this is what I'm going to do. So I started putting things into place as best as I could. And in April of 2014, I handed in my notice, worked out the 6 longest months of my life, and then set up my business. And for ages, I had no clients. Like, I was banging my head against brick walls for the first few years, barely scraping by. But I really value those years from that perspective, because it taught me that I could do that. I'd forgotten, right? I'd forgotten what it had been like, what it was like to not have loads of money coming in every month. And those few rough years at the beginning, from 2014 to 2016, 2017, set me up so well that financially, I finally feel like doesn't matter what anyone throws at me, I can handle it. But the EDI element of it, the DE&I element of it, just meant that I could focus in on my work without feeling perpetually stressed all the time.
Yeah, I love that story and background. I still can't believe that in Europe, your notice periods are so long. I can't wrap my head around telling an employer, hi, I'm quitting in 6 months or 3 months or however long it is. So, but yeah, and I think there's something pretty beautiful about what you just said about those couple of years where it was really tough, because I think in a way it gives you a deeper sense of empathy for another subset of the population who come from, maybe lower socioeconomic statuses or really have to fight for different opportunities. So, yeah, it was great.
Yeah, and just to echo that, it really shows that you were interested in doing this work. I think what we've seen here in the States is that DE&I is like a buzzword, right? We've seen all these companies post all of the social unrest. There were major companies that decided to fold in DE&I to HR. And so we've slowly seen those companies eliminate those divisions. And it's been, an interesting thing, because the question becomes, what was the intent behind this work, right? And you were very deliberate in saying you had this experience and reflected to say, I could do this differently. And you really marched on that as a desire, right? Versus it being just like this hip, new, trendy thing in HR.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't trendy in 2014. No one cared. And plus, it was just me. It still is just me. I occasionally get people to help me with a few things, but otherwise it's just me. And so I was never going to be able to target huge companies, me being little old me with no experience back then. But SMEs were not interested. They didn't have to pay attention to DE&I back then. So even a decently or a financially resourceful, medium-sized company, they weren't interested back then. They're interested now. They have been since 2018, 2019, the tide started to turn. But no one cared back then.
What are some common misconceptions about DE&I that you've encountered, and like how have you went about addressing them in the work you do?
So some of the misconceptions I think come from how our politicians talk about DE&I, specific conversations about unconscious bias, perhaps. I think there are some very low quality training programs out there as well that don't speak to the reality of issues like bias, which is every single one of us is biased. We're just biased in different ways for different reasons. So trying to demonize people for having bias is not helpful. So I think it's because of these sorts of conversations that happen at the wider level, people have real misconceptions about what DEI can achieve in workplaces if it's done pragmatically and if it's done with, I don't know, just a bit of good faith, right? I don't go in to do DE&I work with an agenda that says I'm trying to right the wrongs of the past. That's not my approach at all. My approach is what's happening here at your organization. I don't care what's happening in the wider world, because the wider world there's always going to be something going on. We were talking about that before we started recording. There's always going to be something going on, and the intensity of that will vary from cycle to cycle and year to year. But what's actually happening at this organization? How are people interacting with each other? Do we understand that if I'm coming into work with the two of you and I bring in everything that's ever happened to me and lay it at your feet, that is an unreasonable thing to expect you to have to take on your shoulders, just like if you did that to me. So how are we building working relationships in a way that is fair to everyone, where people can get opportunities and make the most out of opportunities, and in a way where we can hold each other accountable if we see, oh, actually, Megan, that decision that you made earlier, I think some bias may have crept into it. Let's unpick it. Whether that's a decision that affects Lakeisha or whether it's a decision that affects the direction of our work, you know? We have to be able to talk about that. But I can't bring every single bit of emotional baggage that I have and lay it at your feet. And I think that's why people have misconceptions about it, because some people do that. And if you do that in working relationships or personal relationships, I just don't think you can have a truly meaningful relationship. It just becomes a power struggle.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm curious, Heeral, if like the term safe space gets thrown around at all in the UK, because I think, again, kind of comparing like the US approach to the UK approach, what you just said, I think, is so powerful. And I want to spend a minute talking about it, about the people bringing, like, I bring into the workplace everything that has happened to me as a underprivileged woman, you know, for example. And I think in America, we tend to do that. We kind of tend to expect our organization to be aware of where we might be coming from. And we throw around the concept of a safe space. Like, this is a safe space. You can bring your authentic self here, all those things. I think my bias now is I don't think safe spaces truly exist. To what you just said, is everybody has bias, whether or not they want to admit it or not. So curious if that concept gets thrown around, or if that is something that's like American centric, of like your workplace should be your safe space.
So I don't hear I don't hear my clients talking to me and saying, Heeral, help us create a safe space, for example. That's not the way in which the language is used. I talk to my clients about psychological safety, but I'm very clear to them that when I'm talking about creating a psychologically safe environment, I don't mean an environment where no one will ever be upset, where we are holding everyone's hands through absolutely everything, and where the walls are wrapped up in cotton wool, because that's not what a workplace is meant to be. You're there to work, and the safety of that space is about making sure that we can do that in as positive and hopefully in a way that's not detrimental to our well-being, and also where we can make good, high quality decisions, right? So psychological safety is about having an environment where I can say to you and have that conversation, Megan, you know, that decision we need to make, or that one that you're about to make, let's talk about it a bit more, without you getting defensive and saying, why do you think I don't know how to do my job, and is that because I'm an underprivileged woman you're making all these assumptions about me? When people truly feel listened to, even if you don't take all my ideas on board, or I don't take your ideas and roll with every single one of them, the fact that you can share them with me, that we can talk them out, that we can have a productive conversation, or you're having a bad day or a bad year, and you can actually say to me that these are the bits of support that I would benefit from. If we can do that here, then I will be able to work to the best of my ability, considering everything else that's going on. If we can do that, then we actually have a psychologically safe space, and that is what matters. If I can't second guess everything about you, you can't second guess everything about me. That's not possible. And when we start trying to do that is when we end up walking on eggshells around each other. And that's the real problem with DE&I, that everyone is becoming so afraid of saying something that upsets another person, that people are just getting really angry about it. The other side of that is total apathy, right? Where they just say, I don't care, I'm just not going to say anything. It becomes a really transactional workplace where you don't have any meaningful relationships. None of those things are an inclusive environment.
Yeah, that was good. I mean, just thinking, it kind of takes me back. So, Megan and I participated on a panel at our local university. And it was interesting because we had one question, and the preface of the question was, don't get upset with me. I was looking at your LinkedIn bios in preparation for this panel, and everything seemed so flowery and emotional and enthusiastic and very descriptive. And it's very interesting because I'm seeing this come up again just in regards to Megan's comment about safe workplace, and even hearing your perspective about you not going in to a client saying, hey, Harold, I'm inviting you here because we want to create a safe space. And I think oftentimes here in the States, we're often driven by emotional decisions, right? And that leads us to your very point of like tiptoeing around getting to the real work, right? Or just wanting to really coddle everyone because we want everyone to be happy. So nothing really comes out of that, right? Because you're like, oh, I can't say this to Megan. I can't say this to Harold. Oh, well, I won't say anything. And it's interesting because that's where this work has kind of spiraled into. And I do believe that's why, some organizations are asking the question, is this meaningful here? And they're doing these big eliminations because the real work is not being done because we're being so emotionally sensitive to the baggage that people are coming in and throwing at someone's feet. And it's like, you need years of therapy for that. Like this is not going to be solved today.
So it's interesting that you should say that. And I don't even know if I should say this, but I'm going to anyway.
Unfiltered conversations. That's what we promise.
I have seen in my 10 years that there are a lot of people who go into DE&I work from a place of having experienced discrimination, which has happened to a lot of us. You know, I'm not going to make any assumptions about the two of you, but I am sure that on some degree, to a degree, the three of us have faced some form of discrimination. Okay, so that's that. But a lot of people that go into D&I work have had those experiences, and then whatever the extent of the trauma of that experience, they're going into DE&I work because they don't want anyone else to experience that, which is a great thing, a great reason. But if you haven't dealt with the emotional upset of something like that, then you're unlikely to be actually listening to what the people around you are saying about their specific issues. You're just bringing your own pain into their workplace. And that's what I see, where DE&I people, consultants, not in-house people. I can't speak to in-house people, but consultants, they talk endlessly about their own lived experience.
Mm-hmm.
Lived experience, by its nature, is anecdotal. So if I go into a workplace and say, well, this is my lived experience of discrimination according to whatever box I decide to talk about, that only tells you about my experience of discrimination. How does that help you create an inclusive environment for anyone who you think is like me? And that would be based on nothing but an assumption. Or
Mm-hmm.
everyone in general, how do we create inclusion for everyone at our organization based on what Heeral has told us about her experiences of discrimination? How does that actually help a client? I never talk about me. I want my clients to see me as an amorphous blob. I don't matter in the conversation. Yeah, they're not hiring me for me to have an outlet for my pain and hurt. That's what therapy is for, and I've done that. But there are someone who I used to know used a term, and I don't know if it's just, I've not really heard anyone else use it. I can't tell you whether or not it's a kind or an unkind term, but she used the term unprocessed. And that's the word that comes to mind to me when I see people laying all of their pain down at everyone else's feet.
Mm.
You're laying it down at the wrong people's feet. So that's kind of my take on it, that it's just another reason why people switch off from DE&I conversations, because people like me, or consultants like me, are coming in and just talking to them about all the things that have happened to that specific human being. I just don't think that can get us anywhere.
Yeah.
I want to know what's going wrong at the organization and the people who are actually there. I've got nothing to do with that. My experience is, like I said, I just want you to see me. I'm just a blob. It doesn't matter whether I'm a woman or a man, whether I'm straight or gay, whether I'm white or brown, whether I've got a disability or whether I don't have a disability. All of that stuff should be irrelevant to my client. That's how I feel about it.
Yeah. Oh, no, it's so true, because then the clients you're working with, if you were to center your work around your identity, like you were saying, then they're kind of only creating things based on your experience. But then they're also creating programs out of sympathy or pity almost. And that doesn't feel effective either. And I think that that's where on the other side of the ocean, if you will, I think that the negative bias around DEI work is, well, you're saying that this person deserves more
Mm-hmm.
because of where they came from, versus like me, just because I am insert more common identity, I don't deserve the same things as this other person because of history I have no control over. And so, yeah, I think that that's it's a healthier way to look at it, because like you've done the work, you've removed your own identity from the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I always say, like, if you go looking for bias, you'll always find it.
Yep.
It's everywhere. But
Yep.
there's negative bias, or at least we have positive and negative biases, right? It just depends on how they end up being applied in any given moment. It's like the three of us may be sports fans. But we will have a team. That is a bias. But
Mm-hmm.
in the workplace, for the most part, it's unlikely to get in the way of you trying to do your job. But there's
Yeah.
other biases that we have that are very much going to get in other people's way. And we have to be able to tell the difference between those things and exercise some discernment, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I do want to just go back to your comment about unprocessed and it
Oh,
being
no.
and it being negative or positive, because I wanted to just look up the word, right? Just fancy me on that. And the definition is unaltered from original or natural state, not processed. And so when I looked that up, it really kind of hit home, because you're talking about these consultants coming in who have not processed their lived experience, right? So they're not altered, right? So how can you come in and move the needle or have effective change when you're still holding on to this negative experience? And you're actually being paid to go into organizations to help them process their environment and their working relationships, but you are still in an unprocessed state. So I think that's a great word, and I think it really holds true here. So thank you for bringing that up and sharing that with our listeners. I think it is positive, right? Because you're highlighting kind of a moment in time and how someone is showing up in that moment in time.
The reason why I was reticent to say it is because if some people are going to hear what I've said about that specific thing, and it's going to be triggering to them. I'm like, oh, I don't have time for I don't have time for arguing with people about it. It's just my opinion. People may disagree with me. People may think that no, you need to have that. You need to have that pain and share it with people to make them understand how bad it can be for people, and that's fair enough too. It's just that I don't think it's the best way of reaching people who don't have the same skin in the game as you. And so you have to find different ways of reaching them.
Yeah. I think that's a great segue into Megan and I were talking a little bit about just this work in general and how, it's important to some people and it's not important to others. And so
Mhm.
through your work and, consulting with many organizations, like how have you come to accept that this work is more important to others when you're, meeting an organization where they are?
Okay, so I think I've been fortunate enough that I could probably count on one hand where I've been hired by an organization, whether it's a small piece of work or a slightly bigger piece of work, where I've been hired by an organization and it's just been a total box ticking exercise for them. I think the reason why it's only, on one hand is because almost all of my clients come from word of mouth referrals, or what I often run are free taster workshops for HR leaders. So they see how I'm approaching a subject, and even if they buy into it, they can tell or they can decide whether or not my approach is going to speak to the leadership team or not. And so they just self-select themselves. They just self-select themselves in or out. Um, I think I also take time to acknowledge whenever I'm working with leadership teams that cynicism about EDI, DEI exists because of all the things that we've been talking about. I'm not expecting everyone in the room to care about it. And I'm expecting there to be a couple of people who are actively against it because of all the things that they've heard. And so I get my message across with all those different types of audiences in mind, finding a way of showing them the positives of doing this work properly, even if you just want to look at it from a risk mitigation factor. Let's say there's a CFO and all he cares about is, I don't want there to be loads of harassment claims because that will cost us money. I'm like, okay, fine. If that's where your priority stops and starts, I can help you understand, even with that priority, how to do this work properly. Because even from a risk mitigation factor, this is my old actuarial stuff coming in, that we have to be able to look at the information in front of us, not just what people are saying. Let's look at actual data. And so I guess I find by the time I've finished talking to the senior leaders, they've understood where I'm coming from, so I'm not really feeling that much pushback or them just engaging with me in bad faith. I don't know. Maybe I'm just lucky from that perspective, because I don't have time for that really. You know.
I would say you're lucky, and I think you and Megan are in a similar boat. You have your own business, so you can self-select, right? Like, you can get in those rooms and say, our values aren't aligned, or, your intention here doesn't really align with how I do this work or what I'm able to produce, right? But
Mm-hmm.
I am curious if you can share for our listeners, and maybe this is more applicable to the DE&I in-house employees, but, what are some strategies maybe, a DE&I consultant who works inside of the organization can deploy to ensure that their company is not just doing this work on a performance scale, but more on a real, level to create change in the organization?
What can an in-house DE&I person do? I think they need to get very good at communicating. If they haven't done that already, they need to really be able to audit the success of their different communications with people when they're trying to bring stakeholders on board. Because too often I see people just using only emotion. That can only get you so far. They can only get you so far before people just stop listening to you. So you've got to have actual solutions that meet the actual problems, not perceived problems. Okay, and that's where a lot of this pushback comes in, right? People are saying, this is my perception of problems here because these problems exist in society. But how do you know that specific problem exists in this company? And so there's that. It's a difficult one with in-house jobs because a lot of DE&I people have been hired by companies who are window dressing.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to know that until you start. And if you are a window dressing hire, a DEI hire, then then I don't really know that it's worth spending your time banging your head against a brick wall. Look for a new job if you can. And if you can't,
my God.
Our joke on this show, Heeral, is that my solution to most things is to quit your job.
yeah.
So you're singing our truth right now.
I mean, I'm not saying it's easy. Find a new job. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying that the right job exists, but you've got to look for it. You have to. You've got to take ownership. You try and change what you can. You try and change the things that are in your control, And the things that aren't in your control, you have to decide whether can I live with it, or is it too much? Do I need to get out of here? And then take action accordingly. You've got one life, you've got to
Yeah.
live it. You can't just stay there if you have other options.
One of the like spiciest HR questions I always get that I'm always scared to answer is like, Megan, how do you feel about ERGs, employee resource groups? And I never know how to handle that question because I feel like if I give my actual opinion, they're going to be like, oh, she's an asshole. But it's similar to DEI work is if you're not going to, if the ERGs aren't actually empowered,
Mm-hmm.
then it's more insulting to have them. And it's the same with like EDI work is like if all you're going to allow your DEI team is to like have a book club and bring in a speaker every 6 months, then don't have it.
Mm-hmm.
Because those things are nice. They're nice. But does it require an entire department to run? Probably
And
not,
also, it's not a
unless you're
commercial activity. Why do you
Yep.
have people doing that? Get volunteers in from charities to do that for you. If you want someone to run a book club, why are you paying someone to do that sort of thing? Which is why then DEI people lose their jobs.
Yep.
Mhm.
And it goes
Yeah.
back to your Megan and I have been talking about some marketing material. So one day you'll see a shirt that says window dressing and on the back it'll say just quit your job. But I think it goes back to what you're saying, right? If you are just putting up this window dressing, like organizations are always going to ask, what is the ROI? Period. Right. And so it goes back to your initial comment. At some point, there may be a CFO, a COO, or a CEO that says, like, let's look at the data. What has Heeral done for us lately? Right. And if there's no ROI, people are not even bought into this concept just in general. And then they're going to say, you have this whole department that hasn't effectively moved any change. So why keep doing this work? And I think that echoes what Megan is saying. Like, why have this ERG? Why have this book club if it's not really going to have any change? And so, I think that's the $1 million question.
When you mentioned ERGs first, a phrase came to mind that I probably shouldn't say on a professional podcast. But it's an American term.
Professional-ish.
Well, it's an American term that I've heard people use. I'm just going, okay, whatever. The phrase circle jerk came to mind.
Yes.
That's what a badly run ERG is. I'm not saying they're all like that, but that's what a badly run ERG, or an ERG with no momentum, or an ERG with no autonomy. They're not all circle jerks, but they can be.
Yeah. Question for you, Heeral, and maybe for people who aren't just familiar with this work in general or just, are in an organization where all they do is a book club and a guest speaker every 6 months. What is your ultimate goal? Is it self-awareness of leadership of their own biases? Is it the ability to overcome your biases? Is it the ability to talk about them? Is it some combination of those three things? Like when you're working with an organization, what's your ultimate goal with them?
Okay, so that's a good question. At a leadership level, everything you just said about biases, yeah, all those things. Because if anyone who has people management responsibilities, don't care how senior they are, but the minute you accept that responsibility, I think you also take on the responsibility to get better at making decisions. Okay? And I leave it as open as that. You need to get better at making all of the decisions that you are being asked to make, whether they are decisions that impact your individual team members, your team as a whole, or the work that your team is doing, because that's what your biases affect. So there's that. At an employee, like whole organizational level, I get a lot of organizations coming to me who are at the beginning of understanding their inclusion journey. And I always ask the people team, okay, well, you and I both know that most people don't read the employee handbook or HR policies. So can you tell me whether or not you think your people understand what the minimum expectations are? Because if they don't understand minimum expectations around appropriate behaviors in the workplace, if they don't even know what the protected classes are, we call them protected characteristics in the UK. If they don't even know what the protected classes are, if they don't know what behaviors constitute harassment, what behaviors constitute discrimination, then why are you even talking about inclusion? What are you running Awareness Day workshops for, and Awareness Weeks and all these big things for Pride and Black History Month and Women's History Month? You haven't even covered off the basics. So cover off the basics. First, make sure your people understand what is expected of them and what is not, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. Then let's talk about all this other stuff and whether a workshop on a particular protected class is actually going to achieve anything. Because I could run a disability awareness workshop, right? But if you don't have the fundamentals in place, if people don't know what harassment is, if people don't know what to do, if they're experiencing unwanted behavior, who cares if you know the latest terminology around disability?
I love that. And it's interesting because my work, I don't work in the DE&I sphere. Um, and my work is more about the people side. And it's interesting because the concept you just shared rings true in the work I do, from a performance management or from a culture integration standpoint. When we're acquiring something, I'm like, what are our expectations? And like, how do we get everyone on that same foundation, right? And it's so interesting because like that's the core of every work that anyone does. Like if someone doesn't know the expectations, you can't layer on anything greater than that, right? Because you have to start with the basics. So I love that. And I appreciate you kind of calling that out. I do want to go back to the ERGs because I think it would be helpful for our listeners if we have any DE&I consultants or in-house representatives listening in. What are some key elements to make an ERG effective?
You should have co-chairs because it's too much to just place on one person, especially if you have very regular meetings. And to be honest, for an ERG to have any momentum, it needs to have regular meetings. If it's just once every 6 months, what's the point? You don't need one. So there should be two people at the helm. There should be a very clear understanding of psychological safety, but the way in which I described it, not this whole safe space concept. An ERG should also be mindful of who it excludes. Now, let me elaborate on that. Sometimes ERGs, in this grasping of creating a safe space, they say only people from this group can come. So even if people are interested in learning more, the ERG says, well, no, if people who aren't part of this group come along, then it's no longer a safe space. Okay, but be aware that that then means if and when you try and open it up, or if and when you're speaking to the company as a whole and saying, well, we want more interest in our group, and people don't really express that interest, then to maybe reflect on that and certainly reflect on any surprise you might feel about that, because how you exclude people from your ERG is more important than whether you do it or not. Because some people want allies in their ERG, Some people don't want allies in their ERG. How you exclude those people is, you need to be very, very mindful of how you do it. Again, it comes down to the comms. It's just a smaller version. We're just zooming in on the comms. How are you communicating to people what you're doing, why you're doing it? It's as simple as that. And that's a reason why some ERGs fall over, is because they cut people out. And they do it in a really, and this is a UK example, or UK centric view. I don't know how it works in America, really. But if you're going to cut people out, be aware that when you want them to join, and when you want to invite them back in, might not be as interested as they were initially.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's good. I think here in the States, they're kind of ran both ways. Like the organization I'm with today, they include allies. I think some organizations are strictly against that, and it's just that designated group, indigenous people or, and I think it's really up to the organization how they see fit on how they want to run their ERG. But I think it's both camps. It's not one way or another. I think it varies. Would you say that's true, Megan?
Yeah. I mean, and I think what you said is actually probably one of the most powerful pieces. It depends on how the organization wants to run it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's probably part of the problem,
Yep.
right? And that's why I think HR gets in the way. No offense, Lakeisha. No offense to myself and our other HR people, is we're so scared of this group coming together that we try to put bumpers around it,
Mm-hmm.
and that just defeats the purpose of them existing at all. So, yeah, I have like complex feelings on it because I think very few organizations do it in a way that actually helps the people who want to put it together. And then I think you create more consternation and more frustration and more perceptions of bias. Like they said we could have the CRG, but then they won't give us any budget to do anything with it. So why do we even have it?
Yeah. Or they're telling us who can be included and who can be excluded, right? So then it goes back to the whole DE&I. So it's this very warped concept that I think everyone's trying to really wrap their mind around it. And I think what we're seeing in the States are some people are saying, we don't have time for it. We'll take those funds and invest them in something else. Like maybe a company picnic will be better, right? Like
oh gosh, the pizza party is never better than whatever you want to do.
That's just what we're seeing. There is mass layoffs of DE&I at major companies. Megan, maybe you can bring up the recent tractor situation.
Yeah. And I say all this, like we're saying all this, we're picking apart the DEI space in America, but that's not to say that Lakeisha and I don't believe strongly in what these groups are trying to achieve. But I do think there are challenges in the execution, right? And Heeral, that's one of the things I love about your approach is I think it is very rooted in how do we create actual change instead of window dressing. But there was a lot of controversy in America recently because we have our governing body, if you want to call that, of HR people. It's called SHRM, Society of Human Resources Management, which a lot of HR people had complex feelings on to begin with, but like many companies require you to be SHRM certified. It's seen as one of the better institutions for education, and they set a lot of the standard on DEI work just because it's folded in. And we said this previously, whether or not EDI work should exist in HR, I think is still a debate. I'm not 100% sure it should, but recently they came out and they essentially rebranded DEI in America. So in America, it's DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And sometimes people throw belonging in there too. And they have decided to rebrand to just inclusion and diversity. And their messaging is, we believe that equity falls under inclusion, and we think inclusion should always be at the forefront. And if our listeners were on LinkedIn and had any friends in the HR space, like I have never seen so many HR people rally and say, fuck that. A lot of people felt like, they don't speak for me. I disagree. But the core issue, I think, for a lot of HR people, including myself, it's like the first time I got in like fights with people on LinkedIn, it was kind of wild, was you can't have inclusion without equity. Like you can have an inclusive and diverse space and have it not be equitable. These are not the same terms. They're not the same concepts. And to remove the word equity felt very political. It's like, that's the hard one, because that is a lot of what we're talking about. It's the understanding and the appreciation that people are coming in at a different level than others based on their appearance, characteristics, socioeconomic background, et cetera. And so if we remove this word altogether, we're ignoring the problem. We're not actually fixing the problem. We're just trying to make people more comfortable about this concept that is inherently uncomfortable. And so, Heeral, I thought it was really interesting how you were saying like the E is interchangeable in the UK. And so maybe we in America, maybe we have too much emotion around the word equity. Like maybe all of this uproar is for naught, because at the end of the day, if you're doing the work, you're doing the work. Why does it matter what you call it? So I guess I'm curious, how you've observed this kind of little blow up, and if you think the word equity is truly important, or if it's the branding doesn't matter as long as you're doing the work.
Okay, so in the UK, I don't think the branding matters, but I also know people will disagree with me. So there's that. In the US, the branding of DE&I, whichever way you go, but the branding of it is so important because of how polarized the conversation is. So if you're going to make a big change like that and you are a huge organization, you really need to have understood your people's opinions before making a wholesale change like that. I mean, yeah, of course, they can do what they want and they can do that anyway. They don't have to ask all their members, but the members are the ones who pay and keep the organization running and keep the lights on. So there's also, that side of things. The branding of DE&I in America needs a total overhaul, and you can't just change the branding without actually changing how it's done in the first place, because there's clearly a branding problem when there's people out there like Musk saying DEI must die. And that's such an old story now. We're going back to December of last year, right? So I think December of last year. Either way, it was late last year. But when you have hardly anyone over here has that level of clout and influence the way Musk does. But there are some people who grumble about DE&I. No one really cares what they're saying. Okay, either you agree with them or you don't agree with them. It's not going to cause global reverberations. So when you're working in a space that is causing at least national reverberations, but definitely international, because I'm hearing about it over here, then everyone needs to take a minute and say, okay, why is this happening? Is there anything we could do differently? What about our message isn't landing? Because if our message isn't landing, our work's not getting us anywhere. And if our work's not creating the change that we're trying to see, what's the point of doing it? There needs to be a lot of self-reflection, I think, at a lot of levels when it comes to the branding of DE&I. And if that doesn't happen, America is going to keep seeing the level of pushback that it is seeing. Because I think it was Microsoft, right, that just got rid of their diversity team. Okay. When a company like Microsoft does that, it sends a really big message, which is they don't value the work that team achieved. Now, we don't know what that team was doing, and we don't know how they were trying to do it. There was probably something getting lost in translation over there, or the message just wasn't landing, which means they weren't listening to their stakeholders. If your stakeholders aren't buying into what you're saying, the stakeholders are going to turn off the tap. That's how it works. That's how it works with me. If I'm not getting things done for my client the way in which I've promised them, but also in a way that doesn't cause them more problems than it solves, they're going to turn off the tap. So I don't really know what to say other than, yeah, DE&I has a massive branding issue. That branding issue is seeping over here as well. I have to, I come up against it sometimes. But if the individuals working in DE&I don't take a moment to reflect on it, which, to be honest, if they don't, then they are literally as bad as the people they are trying to help change, because all of this change requires self-reflection. And if your way of doing DE&I isn't landing, you need to look at why, and you need to make a change. Because it's like, if I keep going to the gym, oh my goodness, I was going to the gym in 2021, and I was complaining to my friend, who's a power lifter, by the way. My best friend is a power lifter. And I was saying to her, I'm never going to be able to move beyond a 5-kilogram dumbbell to do dumbbell curls. And I was stuck on the 5 kg dumbbell for so long, or it felt like so long, whatever. I decided something needed to change, not just because I couldn't curl 5 kgs, but like a whole bunch of stuff around my fitness. And I got expert advice from someone who actually knew what they were doing. And now I'm up to 8 kgs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yay.
But I never thought I would be able to do that. But that's because I was going about it wrong.
Yeah.
Okay. So if something isn't changing, and in fact, if something's getting worse, you got to change something. You can't get so stuck in your idea of what a perfect workplace looks like and what a perfect society looks like, because it doesn't exist. It never will. So you've got to work with what you've got. And I know a lot of people don't like that view, because a lot of DEI people are, sometimes they are like, it's almost like you can tell from the way they're talking about the change that needs to happen, that really the change they think needs to happen is to burn everything down and start again. I don't want to live in that hellscape. Okay. I don't want to live in that hellscape.
Whereas I think like half of America wants to do that. No,
Right.
I'm kidding. We don't get political here. We should probably cut that.
Don't get me wrong. I love watching apocalyptic TV shows and films, because it lets me live out that fantasy of me being like, oh, I will do whatever it takes to, no one's going to get in my way. But that's not the actual world I live in, and I don't really want the lights to go out. I'm trying to be realistic in the life that I'm leading and how I'm working with people. And yeah, I don't know. That was a very rambling answer.
No, that was great. I do want to just go back to, your mention about Microsoft. So in addition to Microsoft, we've seen major tech companies cut their DE&I teams by 50% or cut the team altogether. So we have Zoom, a part of that, Snap, which is Snapchat, Meta, Tesla, DoorDash, Lyft, Home Depot, Wayfair, and our favorite X, formerly known as Twitter. But
no, it's Twitter.
Kind of talking through, all those companies, and there's been many more that I didn't list. But how do you see the future of DE&I evolving? Where do we go from here?
Okay, so before I answer that, the people who are working in the DE&I team at X should have started looking for a new job the minute the deal went through.
Mm-hmm.
That's on them. That was written in the stars. Okay.
A little
What,
pissing in the wind there.
that was the other phrase that came to mind.
Circle jerks, pissing in the
Circle
wind.
jerks.
We got an X-rated episode today.
Right, right.
Get it?
So what is was the question, what does the future hold for
Yeah, or what does the future look like? How do we see it evolving?
Okay, it's that we're going to see way more pushback than we already have before anything changes, because that kind of level of self-reflection that I mentioned before hasn't started happening yet. People are still very much digging their heels in. People have very much got their idea of how this should be done, what the fix is, what the problem is, who the problem is, until the rigidity in thinking on all sides, whether people are in favor of DE&I or whether they are against it, until that rigidity loosens up, it's going to keep going on the trajectory that it currently is. I don't know what will change that trajectory. I think actually what's going to happen, okay, this is what I'm preparing for. I think actually what is going to happen is that these conversations are going to get shut down very soon, because we're going to have bigger problems on our hands, like a financial crisis. Okay? I believe there's another financial crisis coming. When that financial crisis hits, all of these conversations will die. When they will start back up again, I don't know. I know that's not a very positive or hopeful response, but I'm looking at the wider economic picture, nothing to do with DEI. I'm looking at the money printing machines that we have going in America, in the UK, in Europe, and it doesn't seem sustainable to me. So we may be forced into a rebrand that comes as a result of a hiatus.
Yeah. I mean, in Microsoft, it wasn't in their public message, but private messages leaked. And one of the things the CEO said is that he didn't see the DEI team as business critical. And while that's like a knife in the heart for a lot of us that care about this work, it's to the comment that we made earlier is, what is the ROI? Well, what are those teams really bringing? And if these programs don't have like a true tangible outcome that leadership can understand and see on paper and see associated dollar signs with, yeah, it will get put on hold. It will, again, it's not business critical. And so to your point, Heeral, when we're talking about a financial crisis or times being down for businesses, it's all about getting lean and doing what you can to survive.
Yeah.
Now, I think we could probably argue that Microsoft has the money, but I think for smaller organizations, for example, they'll be very impacted.
I mean, the kind of companies that I work with, 100%. You know, I think there will be a slowdown if a financial a complete stop if a financial crisis hits, and I think that is the bigger picture. Because if a financial crisis hits, every single one of us has got bigger fish to fry than running an awareness-raising workshop on the latest or the current awareness month.
That's very true. I was just going to agree and echo what you're saying. And I think sometimes we're so close to it that we can't lift up and get that perspective. So thank you for bringing our perspective to a 30,000 foot view, because I think that's really important. And oftentimes that's some of the stuff I hear, you know, in the organization I'm in right now, like, oh, I don't have time for that, right? Like, I'm trying to do, and so it's the same rhetoric, right? Like when, you know, a financial crisis comes, it's like, I don't have the money for that. I need to do, right? So it's reassessing and then prioritizing based on what's in your bank account, right? And so how do you do that? By eliminating things.
And I think that's where it's gonna there's one thing having an in-house team that's not business critical. It's a whole nother ball game being an external consultant who cannot bring a business critical lens to their work. Okay, so who can only bring emotion to their work. And I think even if there are any people listening who didn't like what I said about the kind of DEI consultants that I was mentioning before who are unprocessed, and if you are that person, I'm sorry that I said that, but also I want you to take a view at 30,000 feet and ask yourself, if that financial crisis hits, how much of a buffer have you got? Yeah, that's one of the bigger issues of the day. It doesn't really, and this doesn't matter what identity group you're part of. The bigger issue across the US and the UK is that most people are one, maybe two paychecks away from not being able to pay their rent.
Mm-hmm.
That's the bigger problem.
Yeah.
And so I don't know that I have a solution or have a big kind of plan in my head. I just know that if the crisis hits, I can coast for a little while whilst I try and find alternatives to bringing money in, whatever those might be. And so that's what people need to try and do. And I'm not saying it's easy. It's not easy. It's really hard. But that's what you got to try and do. Because there's too many people in a precarious financial position.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. This was such a rich conversation, and I really appreciate, having your perspective on this because I've interfaced with a lot of DE and I people, and I will tell Megan, I'm like, they're full of shit, And it's so refreshing to have
Calling it like it is.
someone who knows their work and your intentions are pure behind it, because I think that's what I often experience is the unprocessed or the people who are trying to do this work that's not really connecting with the population they're serving, and so I see it. It's almost like looking at a scary movie and you're like, oh my God, he's going to kill you. Like, run, And so we do always like to just wrap up with what are 3 practical things that you would like to share with our listeners that they can walk away with based on the work that you're doing?
Okay, so I think every single person who's listening to this who manages a team of people should take on the responsibility of understanding their biases. I'm not saying you need to stand up and declare them to the world, of course not. But you need to understand what they are, where they've come from, whether they are positive biases, whether they're negative biases. How do you use your biases? How do you use your influence, to impact outcomes? And what part do your biases play in that? The best way to do that and to try and understand your biases is to have someone who you trust wholly, who you can speak to confidentially, whether that's a therapist or whether that is your best friend, whoever it might be. So I guess that's number 1. Number 2 is if you're trying to figure out what your EDI strategy should be, start at the basics. Don't go all bells and whistles. Find out whether your people even know the fundamentals, because until they know the fundamentals, everything else is pointless. And my third one, I don't know if I've got a third one. Don't get so hung up on language. Every single one of us has awareness gaps and blind spots, biases, every single one of us. It is not possible for any one of us to go through life without offending another person, whether that's offending them because you made some comment about their mum, or whether it's offending them because of their sexuality or other identity marker, whatever it might be. It's not possible. It could happen accidentally, unintentionally, and it might be very insensitive, but you didn't mean it. So if you can do it, you need to remember that someone is going to do that to you. So now hold those two truths. The shoe could be on the other foot. So now how do we come together? Because real life isn't social media. You can't block and delete your colleague. You're going to see them again, or at least talk to them again, whether it's in real life or in a Zoom meeting or, on the factory floor or wherever it might be. So we have to be able to navigate these tricky conversations without having a go at each other at every turn for not knowing the latest terminology. Language evolves all the time. No one can keep on top of it. And as long as people aren't being malicious, then accept that the mistake happened and let's bounce back from it.
Yeah.
We have to do that. Otherwise, we're just going to stop talking to each other. And then there's no point to any of this.
Well, powerful takeaways, Heeral. Thank you again so much for sharing your opinions and expertise and just your groundedness on this topic. That is very emotional. And I know I've taken away so much from this conversation, maybe doing my own self-reflection. And I think that the key to this kind of work is conversations. It is talking to people. It's talking to people who aren't like you. It's talking to people outside of your bubble. And it's taking that moment of grace to say, at the end of the day, we're both just human beings trying to do our jobs and go home.
Yep.
And, assuming that positive intent. And I think we've decided that DEI does need a rebrand. I'm not going to say that Sherm was right, because clearly the message was not received well, but it probably is time for us on the US to reflect and how do we get away from this extreme polarization around this topic that I think is business critical. I just don't think we've gone about it in a way that shows how valuable it is, at least here in the States. So thank you again.
This was great. And I feel renewed in D&I work. If I can be quite honest, I've lost a little faith in it because I've seen so many imposters. And I think that's also to what these big companies are seeing, right? People coming in with their dog and pony show, and you're like, this is fictitious, And so thank you for just sharing and renewing kind of my faith in this work. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much. I really love this conversation. It's probably the most candid one I've had about DE&I. I've certainly never said the word circle jerk in a podcast before.
No, that's how really, we roll here.
Offline and unfiltered.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. So, Heeral, before we wrap up, if folks are interested in following you, connecting with you, yelling at you for being unprocessed, no, I'm kidding. Listeners, please don't do that. Hiring you for their organizations, as you have clients all over the place. So where can folks find you?
The best place to find me is on LinkedIn. I have a couple of other social media handles, but I don't use them, not for work. So LinkedIn is the place. And you'll have my name in the episode notes, so I'm not going to spell it out for people. But yeah, I think I'm the only one with that first name and surname combination, so I'm pretty easy to find.
It's good for your SEO.
Right.
Yes, listeners, we'll link.
It might be a bad thing.
Oh no, that was that other Heeral.
Right.
Well, thank you again, Heeral, and thank you, listeners, for sticking through this a little spicy conversation, but I think very valuable, and we will catch you next time. Bye.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. The views expressed on this show are based on our personal opinions and should not be taken as legal advice. contact an attorney for that.
Our theme music and sound was produced by Equilibrium. Our artwork and logo was created by Jillian Blanco. We are an independently run podcast. If you like our show, please rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to share your story or expertise, email us at stories@offlineandunfiltered.com. We can't wait to hear from you.